Access denied. The words flashed again on the glass panel beside the boardroom door, cold and final, as Ava Mitchell stood perfectly still in the hallway of Mitchell Dynamics headquarters, Manhattan, 42 floors above the city, where morning traffic looked like moving noise rather than people, her expression unreadable as employees passed behind her pretending not to notice the founder of the company being held outside her own meeting space. Inside the room, Richard Coleman's voice carried through the sealed door. Calm, rehearsed, controlled, saying she was not on the approved attendee list for the executive board session, despite the system quietly displaying something very different on internal logs that still read, Founder access. Active. Ava didn't knock again. She didn't raise her voice. She simply studied the reflection in the glass, like she was measuring something only she could see. Inside the room, Ethan Blake leaned back in his chair with the comfort of someone who believed authority was something you could borrow rather than earn. He glanced toward the door and said she was disrupting protocol, suggesting security handle it quietly, as if removing presence could erase origin. Near the far end of the table, Laura Bennett shifted in her seat, her fingers hovering over her tablet where a faint system alert had appeared earlier but never fully opened. It read, Founding credential detected. Yet she said nothing, not because she agreed, but because silence in rooms like this often felt like survival. Ava finally spoke, her voice low enough that only the nearest microphone caught it. Check the system again, she said, not as a request, but as an observation of fact. Inside the boardroom, Richard smiled slightly, as if indulging a misunderstanding, replying that systems followed governance and governance followed authorization, not sentiment. But what he did not see was the quiet synchronization happening across Mitchell Dynamics' internal network, subtle shifts in permissions, audit trails awakening, dormant protocols beginning to respond to a signal that only one person in the building could trigger. Ava turned slightly, looking down the long hallway where glass walls reflected her silhouette multiplied into fragments. And for a moment, she remembered a smaller room years ago when she had signed the original founding charter of the company. A moment where she had said clearly that no system she built would ever be allowed to forget who created it. Inside the boardroom, Ethan leaned forward again, impatient now, suggesting they proceed without her, while Laura's screen flickered once more, stronger this time, displaying override eligibility confirmed. Her breath caught, but she still said nothing. And then Ava raised her hand and tapped her phone once, a simple motion, almost unremarkable. Yet somewhere deep inside Mitchell Dynamics infrastructure, a dormant command recognized its source, and the atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted in ways no one could immediately name. Richard's tablet dimmed for half a second, then restored. Ethan's access panel refreshed without input, and Laura finally whispered to herself what she should have said earlier. But it was too late because Ava Mitchell was no longer waiting to be invited into the room she built. She was already deciding what the room would become next. Inside the boardroom, the air had begun to feel subtly different, not louder, not colder, but heavier, as if the room itself was recalculating the meaning of what authority meant. Richard Coleman noticed it first in the smallest way possible, a faint delay when his tablet refreshed the meeting agenda, a fraction of a second where his privileges did not respond as expected. He frowned but dismissed it as a network inconsistency. Ethan Blake, however, leaned forward with growing impatience, insisting that they proceed with the session and treat the situation outside as a simple administrative misunderstanding. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether the structure above him could ever fail. Laura Bennett, still silent, watched her screen flicker again, this time more persistent, the message returning sharper than before. Founding credential detected, confirming identity layer. She felt a tightening in her chest, but did not interrupt, because interrupting Richard in meetings like this was rarely rewarded. Outside the boardroom, Ava Mitchell remained still, her phone held loosely at her side, not rushed, not anxious, simply aligned with something already in motion. She was not watching the door anymore. She was watching time itself, because she knew systems did not fail suddenly. They corrected themselves gradually before the correction became visible. Inside the room, Ethan gestured toward the door again, suggesting security escalate the situation, while Richard finally allowed a faint irritation to surface, saying that if someone believed they could override board governance by simply standing in a hallway, then they misunderstood how corporations functioned. But as he spoke, the room lights dimmed for less than a second, not enough to alarm anyone individually, but enough for 3 people to notice at the same time. Laura's tablet displayed a new line she had never seen before. Protocol Layer 1 initiated, and this time she leaned forward slightly, reading it twice. Ava finally moved, taking 1 step closer to the glass, her reflection aligning with the boardroom table in a way that made it feel like she was already inside the discussion rather than outside it. She spoke again, her voice calm, precise, and unchanged, saying that governance only functioned when identity was correctly assigned. Ethan laughed softly at the statement, interpreting it as emotional language dressed in technical terms. But Richard hesitated for the first time, because his own access panel had begun to refresh repeatedly without input, showing confirmation requests he did not authorize. Laura's breathing slowed as she saw the phrase, "Founder Override Sequence Active." And in that moment, she understood that nothing about the situation was external anymore. It was internal. It was structural. It was already happening. She looked up toward Richard as if waiting for permission to speak. But before she could, every screen in the room briefly synchronized at once, displaying the same line of text. Identity verification matched. Ava Mitchell. And the silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition beginning to form too late, because outside the glass Ava Mitchell was no longer being evaluated by the system. She was now the point from which the system was evaluating everything else. The moment the phrase identity verification matched, Ava Mitchell appeared across every screen in the boardroom. The atmosphere changed from confident control to silent recalibration. Richard Coleman stared at the display as if waiting for it to correct itself, but it did not. Ethan Blake leaned forward, voice tightening as he demanded clarification from the internal system dashboard, insisting that there must be an authorization conflict or a delayed sync. Yet the system did not respond with error. It responded with confirmation, repeated and precise, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment longer than anyone in the room. Laura Bennett felt her hands go still above her tablet, because every security layer she opened now returned the same status: founder credential active, override eligibility confirmed, and beneath it a line she had never seen before: system alignment priority 1. Outside the boardroom, Ava Mitchell remained still, but her stillness was no longer passive. It was directional, as though the building itself was beginning to orient around her position. Richard finally spoke again, but his tone had shifted, less certainty, more inquiry, asking whether this was an internal testing protocol or a system demonstration scheduled without notice. Ethan quickly agreed, attempting to frame the situation as a technical rollout rather than an authority reversal. But the language of the system did not support their interpretation, because across every connected device in Mitchell Dynamics headquarters, notifications began to appear simultaneously, indicating that executive permissions were being reassigned in real time. Laura's screen then displayed a new message that made her inhale sharply. Board session access temporarily suspended pending founder authorization review. And in that moment, she looked up at Richard not as a colleague, but as someone realizing the structure beneath them had changed shape without permission. Ava finally raised her hand again, and the gesture triggered something subtle but absolute: the boardroom door unlocked without sound, not opening fully but releasing resistance, as if acknowledging a corrected assumption. Richard noticed first, then Ethan, then Laura, and none of them spoke because the system had already spoken for them. Ava took 1 step forward, and as she did, the interior boardroom display shifted from agenda view to structural hierarchy view, where names once listed as decision-makers were now repositioning into advisory status. Ethan attempted to access his administrative panel but found it restricted, not by error, but by designation, and Richard's expression tightened as his own access label changed from chair authorization to temporary review status. Laura whispered that this was not possible under standard corporate governance protocols, but the system responded immediately beneath her words with a quiet update line reading, "Protocol supersedes governance when founder presence is confirmed." And Ava finally entered the room, not hurried, not triumphant, simply present, allowing the space to acknowledge what it had already verified. And as she approached the head of the table, the lighting adjusted subtly without command. aligning focus toward her position as if the building itself had corrected its understanding of leadership. And in that quiet transformation, the meeting was no longer something she had been excluded from. It had already been redefined before she arrived. As Ava Mitchell stepped fully into the boardroom, the shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was structural, as if every object inside had quietly acknowledged a new reference point for authority. Richard Coleman remained standing near the center of the table, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty. His eyes moving between the screens and Ava, as if searching for an explanation that would restore the previous reality. Ethan Blake attempted to reassert control by accessing his executive dashboard again. But the interface no longer responded with his standard permissions. Instead, it returned a simple status line indicating restricted advisory access, pending founder confirmation. Laura Bennett, still seated, felt the weight of the moment intensify as every device in front of her synchronized again, this time displaying a full structural update of Mitchell Dynamics governance layers. And at the top of it all, one line remained constant: founder active presence confirmed. Ava walked slowly toward the head of the table without urgency, her footsteps measured and deliberate, not because she needed to assert dominance, but because the room itself was already adjusting its alignment to her position. Richard finally spoke, attempting to regain procedural footing by stating that any system change of this scale required formal board approval and documented authorization cycles. But his voice carried less conviction than before. Ethan added quickly that no internal deployment of this magnitude could occur without scheduled enterprise notice. Yet as he spoke, every screen in the room refreshed simultaneously, removing the board agenda entirely and replacing it with a governance reclassification interface that none of them had seen before. Laura's breathing became uneven as she read the new hierarchy mapping, where her role and Ethan's had been repositioned into temporary operational review status. She looked up at Richard, as if expecting him to correct it, but Richard was staring at his own credentials, which now displayed a subtle but unmistakable label change from chair authority to interim review pending founder validation. Ava finally stopped at the head of the table and placed one hand lightly on the surface, not as a gesture of possession but as confirmation of presence. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm and steady, stating that governance structures only function when identity and origin are correctly synchronized within the system. Ethan shook his head slightly, insisting this must be a layered audit response or a delayed back-end reconciliation error. But the system responded instantly to his doubt by updating every interface in the room with the same confirmation line: founder override fully engaged. And at that moment, the room no longer felt like it belonged to anyone attempting to control it, because control itself had already been redefined by the system they thought they were operating. Ava looked around the table once, meeting no resistance, only recognition delayed by disbelief. And in that silence, the final layer of assumption collapsed, leaving only one operational truth remaining in every display, every credential, and every access point. She was not being granted entry into the boardroom. She was the reason the boardroom existed in its current form at all. The silence inside the boardroom had begun to feel less like an absence of sound, and more like a shared realization that reality had already shifted. Ava Mitchell remained at the head of the table, her presence steady, composed, and uninterrupted by the quiet turbulence unfolding across every device in the room. Richard Coleman was still standing, but his posture had changed slightly. No longer the posture of a man guiding a meeting, but of someone trying to re-establish reference points that were no longer available. Ethan Blake attempted once more to access the executive control panel through his tablet, but the interface now returned a uniform restriction notice stating that all operational permissions required founder-level synchronization. Laura Bennett watched this unfold in silence, her screen now showing a continuous cascade of system confirmations, each one reinforcing the same message: governance hierarchy recalibrated, and beneath it, a secondary line that repeated with quiet finality: founder authority active and primary. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm enough that it did not compete with the tension in the room. It simply existed above it. She stated that systems do not change identity, they only correct misalignment. And as she said it, Every screen in the boardroom updated simultaneously, removing individual control panels entirely and replacing them with a single unified governance display. Richard's expression tightened as he realized that his access was no longer being restricted manually. It had been reclassified at the architectural level. Ethan stepped forward slightly, trying to regain psychological control by questioning whether this was an unauthorized override event or a simulated administrative test. But before he could finish, the system itself responded through every connected speaker interface, confirming in neutral tone that all changes were validated through founder origin authentication. Laura's hands trembled slightly above her tablet as she read the next update, which indicated that all pending board resolutions had been paused until structural alignment review was complete. She looked at Ava as if searching for confirmation that this was still a negotiable situation. But Ava's expression remained unchanged, not distant, not emotional, simply resolved. Richard finally attempted to assert procedural authority again, stating that a founder could not unilaterally reassign governance structure without board consensus. But his sentence lost weight halfway through as his own credentials refreshed again, this time removing the interim designation entirely and replacing it with observer status pending structural review. Ethan noticed it at the same time and fell silent, his confidence collapsing into uncertainty as his access reverted to view-only permissions across all internal systems. Ava moved her gaze across the room slowly, acknowledging each person not as opposition, but as participants in a process they no longer controlled. And then she stated that what they were experiencing was not an override. It was a correction, because the system had always known its origin point. Only the users had forgotten, and as those words settled into the space, the final layer of resistance dissolved without announcement, leaving only one operational state visible on every interface in Mitchell Dynamics headquarters: founder authority fully established. And in that moment, the boardroom was no longer a place where decisions were being made. It was a place where decisions were being redefined in real time. The boardroom had fully transitioned into a state where silence no longer felt like waiting, but like confirmation. Every screen across the table displayed the same stabilized message: founder authority fully established and governance layers synchronized. Yet the shift was not loud or dramatic. It was precise, like a system correcting a long-standing assumption. Ava Mitchell remained at the head of the table with a calm presence that did not escalate with the environment, but instead defined it. Richard Coleman stood motionless now, his earlier certainty replaced with a quiet recalibration of understanding as he repeatedly glanced at his own interface, which no longer offered him decision authority, only observational access. Ethan Blake attempted once more to speak, but his words stalled as his device refreshed again and again until it settled into a single unchanging status: operational input suspended pending. Structural realignment. Laura Bennett finally set her tablet down slightly, as if physical distance from the screen might stabilize her thoughts. But the information did not require interpretation anymore. It was explicit. Every system in Mitchell Dynamics had aligned to a single verified origin point. Ava's voice broke the silence again, not louder, but more defined, stating that what they were witnessing was not an activation event, but a recognition event, because the company's infrastructure had always been designed to resolve identity conflict at the source level. Richard slowly turned his head toward her, trying to reconcile procedure with what was unfolding, and asked in a lower tone whether this level of override required external authorization from the board of directors. But even as he asked, his own screen updated again, removing the question from relevance by replacing his entire access layer with a neutral status classification labeled System Observer. Ethan stepped back slightly from the table now, his confidence fully replaced by uncertainty as he realized every attempt to reassert control only resulted in further reduction of his permissions. Laura's screen then shifted again, this time displaying a historical log sequence she had never been granted access to before, showing the original founding architecture of Mitchell Dynamics. And at the top of that architecture, a single unchanged identifier: Ava Mitchell, primary system origin. Her breath caught as she realized this was not a new decision being made. It was a long-standing one finally being enforced. Ava looked around the room and continued speaking in the same steady tone, explaining that governance was never meant to be interpreted through presence or hierarchy, but through origin consistency. and that once origin was verified, all secondary authority structures automatically reclassified themselves. Richard's expression tightened as the final implication settled in, because it meant every decision he believed he had been making was only ever temporary interpretation, not true control. Ethan tried one last time to access his communication panel, but it no longer responded at all, instead displaying a final system line confirming full transition to founder-governed architecture. And as that message stabilized across every screen, the room reached its final state of stillness, not because anything had been silenced, but because there was nothing left in the system that could contradict what it already knew to be true. The final system state inside the boardroom no longer felt like an unfolding event, but like a completed equation. Every interface stabilized, every permission layer aligned, every authority marker reduced to a single unified truth centered on Ava Mitchell. Richard Coleman stood near the table with his hands no longer gesturing, no longer attempting to negotiate meaning from what he was seeing. Because meaning itself had already been redefined by the system before him, Ethan Blake remained frozen in place. His device now nothing more than a display terminal showing read-only confirmation of founder-governed architecture, while Laura Bennett stared at the historical lineage panel still visible on her screen, where the founding layer of Mitchell dynamics was now permanently linked to Ava's verified identity, not as a role, but as origin. Ava remained at the head of the table, her posture unchanged, as if the room had simply caught up to a reality she had never left. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that did not compete with the silence but structured it. She stated that the system was never designed to remove leadership arbitrarily, but to resolve misalignment when interpretation drifted too far from origin. Richard finally broke his silence, his voice lower now, no longer asserting authority but attempting to understand the boundaries of what he was witnessing, asking what would happen to the board structure moving forward. But even as he asked, the system interface in front of him updated in real time, replacing board authority active with board advisory framework initiated. Ethan looked down at his screen as a final notification appeared, confirming that all executive privileges had been transitioned to observer classification pending founder directive, and for the first time, he did not attempt to challenge it. Because there was nothing left to challenge, Laura's screen then displayed a final synchronization log, showing every decision made in the last several years of Mitchell Dynamics operations being reclassified under conditional interpretation status, meaning none of them had ever been final in the way they believed. Ava stepped slightly forward from the head of the table and placed both hands lightly on the surface, not as a gesture of control, but as confirmation of presence within a system that had now fully acknowledged her as its reference point. She explained calmly that governance without correct origin becomes interpretation, and interpretation without origin becomes assumption. Richard lowered his gaze briefly, processing the implication that the structure he had enforced was always secondary to a layer he never accessed. Ethan finally sat down slowly without instruction, his movement no longer driven by authority or resistance, but by acceptance of system finalization. And as the last line on every screen stabilized into a single unified statement reading founder-governed architecture fully active, the boardroom itself felt less like a place where decisions were made and more like a space where decisions had already been resolved before anyone entered it. The boardroom had reached a state where even uncertainty no longer had room to expand, because every system interface, every governance panel, and every internal display had already settled into a single unified classification of reality, founder-governed architecture fully active, and within that framework Richard Coleman stood motionless, no longer attempting to reinterpret what he was seeing, but instead quietly absorbing the implications of a structure that had moved beyond his authority entirely. Ethan Blake remained seated now, his hands resting near a disabled control tablet that no longer accepted input of any kind, while Laura Bennett continued to observe the cascading system logs that were still updating in real time, not with instability, but with finality, each line confirming the same outcome across different layers of Mitchell Dynamics infrastructure. Ava Mitchell remained at the head of the table, her presence unchanged, as if nothing around her had shifted at all except everyone else's understanding of it. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same controlled clarity that had defined every prior instruction. stating that once origin alignment is confirmed, structural roles no longer function as authority. They function only as temporary operational designations. Richard finally exhaled slowly, asking in a subdued tone what the system intended to do with existing board positions moving forward. But even as the question left his mouth, the answer was already appearing across every screen in the room, not as interpretation, but as execution logic. Governance reclassification sequence initiated. Ethan looked down as his access panel updated again, this time removing even advisory permissions and replacing them with passive audit visibility only. Laura's screen followed next, displaying a full organizational map of Mitchell dynamics where executive titles were gradually fading into neutral labels, replaced by system function roles that no longer required individual approval. Ava stepped slightly closer to the center of the table, her movement unhurried, and stated that governance without correct origin creates structural drift, and structural drift always resolves when the system restores its reference point. Richard lowered his gaze as his own designation shifted once more, now labeled former chair under review for structural misalignment. And for the first time, he did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because nothing he could say would change the classification already applied to him. Ethan finally spoke quietly, not as a challenge, but as a realization, asking whether any of this could be reversed through board consensus, but the system responded before Ava could, updating every display with a single uniform statement. Consensus no longer required under founder authority protocol. Laura's breathing slowed as she realized that every decision ever made under her watch had now been recontextualized as conditional rather than final. And in that realization, there was no anger left, only recalibration. Ava placed one hand lightly on the table again and said that this was not a removal of leadership, but a correction of attribution, because leadership without origin is only participation, and participation without origin is only observation. Richard finally sat down slowly, not out of defeat, but because standing no longer served any structural purpose within the room. Ethan followed a moment later, and Laura closed her tablet completely for the first time, not because she was told to, but because there was nothing left on it that required interpretation. And as the final system update stabilized across every interface in Mitchell Dynamics headquarters, the entire boardroom reached a state of complete alignment, where authority no longer needed to be enforced because it had already been permanently assigned to its original source. The boardroom had settled into a final state of equilibrium where no further system alerts appeared because every possible layer of ambiguity had already been resolved. And within that stillness, Ava Mitchell remained at the head of the table with the same controlled presence that had guided every prior shift in the room, while Richard Coleman sat quietly now with his hands resting on the table surface. No longer attempting to access authority he understood had been redefined beyond his control. Ethan Blake remained motionless, his device fully locked into passive observation mode, and Laura Bennett, who had once tried to interpret each system update as an anomaly, now simply watched the stabilized governance display that confirmed in clear structured language that all executive roles had been reclassified under founder-governed architecture. Ava looked across the room slowly, not as a challenge, but as confirmation that understanding had finally replaced resistance. And when she spoke, her voice carried a final clarity that no longer needed to instruct the system, but only to acknowledge it, stating that the purpose of structure was never to create distance between origin and operation, but to ensure that alignment could always be restored when interpretation drifted. Richard lowered his gaze slightly, as if processing the full weight of what that meant, not only for the present moment, but for every decision previously made under the assumption of independent authority. Ethan finally spoke in a calm voice, not questioning anymore, but acknowledging that what they had believed to be leadership was actually a function of delegated visibility rather than origin control. Laura closed her eyes briefly as the final governance map updated one last time across all internal systems, removing all temporary classifications and replacing them with a single unified hierarchy that no longer required debate or approval cycles. Ava then stepped slightly away from the head of the table, not because she was leaving authority, but because authority no longer required positioning, and she stated that systems do not erase people. They simply correct misattributed control until origin and operation are no longer separated by misunderstanding. Richard finally exhaled fully, accepting that the structure he had enforced was never independent of its source. Ethan placed his device down on the table without instruction, acknowledging the end of its functional role, and Laura remained still, now observing not as a participant in uncertainty, but as a witness to completion. As the final confirmation message appeared across every interface in Mitchell Dynamics headquarters stating founder authority fully stabilized and governance alignment complete, Ava looked around the room one last time and spoke a final statement with the same steady calm that had defined her presence from the beginning, saying that real leadership is not defined by volume, interruption, or correction, but by the ability to remain consistent when systems attempt to misinterpret their own origin. And in that moment, there was no further reaction needed from anyone in the room, because everything had already been resolved at the structural level, leaving only a quiet understanding that what they had experienced was not a takeover, but a restoration of what had always been true.